Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 158, a developer's guide into the world of web standards. We are your hosts today, Justin Ribeiro, Amal Hussein, Leon Revel. Hello, wonderful people.
Hey.
Hi, everyone.
How's it going?
Pretty good, thank you.
Any day I can pronounce my name is a good day, Justin. So it's going well.
And you can tell how well my day's going because I mispronounced my own name today, which is a real skill, let me tell you. Before we introduce our guest this week, I'm going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thank you, Justin. So first of all, make sure you take the TC39 Developer Engagement Survey, which will help TC39 better understand how they engage with the developer community. Angular 6 RC0 has just been made available on GitHub, so check it out and help the Angular team by reporting any issues you find. Chrome 66 Beta is now available, which includes many new things, including the new asynchronous clipboard API, which makes it much easier to add text to the clipboard and also integrates with the permissions API. Safari Technology Preview 52 is now available, which includes improvements to Service Worker, WebAssembly, and so much more. And finally, JSConf Australia has just finished with both days of video already available on YouTube, so make sure you go and check those out. And that's everything from me for This Week in Web.
Thank you, Leon. Some interesting stuff this week. This Safari Technology Preview. Improvements to Service Worker. It always makes me happy. And speaking of service workers and things of that nature, today we're talking about web standards and the wonderful world that, as developers, you may not know exist about exactly how the APIs can come to be on the wonderful web platform that we all develop for. Today, we're happy to invite our guest, Jory Burson. Jory, so good of you to be on the show. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a super rad experience so far.
Fantastic. We like to keep it rad. I feel like that's a word that needs to come back, by the way. I really enjoy that word immensely.
I'm trying to bring it back. Yeah.
So for people who don't know you, tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I am the Chief Operating Officer of a company called Boku LLC, and we're a technology consulting firm based here in Boston. And I'm also a member of the ECMA International Executive Committee, which is the standards organization that is the home of TC39. I also represent Boku at the W3C and on the JS Foundation as well. And those are other entities that you may have heard of that do a lot for our web technologies. So, and I have the pleasure of working with Amel many days of the week. So probably my greatest,
I think the best part of your week.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So we're so
I know talking to them all is the best part of my week as well. I just want to point that out, just so there's no confusion online. There's no war on the podcast.
Yeah, no.
Some podcasts are built on top of these things, not us. So, Jory, how did you get started in the wonderful world of web standards? I'm always very curious because everyone sort of has a different origin story when it comes to, wow, I'd like to make the web better.
Yeah, definitely. So, I came to web development like I think a lot of your listeners did, which is just, I was like a bored teenager at home trying to do some crap online and, there's this thing called HTML and there's this thing called CSS and JavaScript and I can make web pages about horses, and I'm not even lying. That's what I did for fun. And so it was sort of like this means to an end, and which I rather enjoyed. And then some number of years later, I began working here at Boku, and we were hosting a number of meetups. And importantly, we hosted the TC39 meetings, the CouchDB group, and then W3C and the tag several times. And that was sort of my first introduction to this sort of other thing that was happening beyond like the day-to-day course of our work here, which was, we were building web apps and tools and products for customers. But then there was this other sort of open source community and technology management thing that was happening. And I was like, so what exactly, would you say you do here in these TC39 meetings? And that was about 6 years ago. And so 7 years ago. And so I started asking questions of the folks who were going and just learning a lot. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of really important, cool stuff that's happening that I had no idea about. And I didn't think that a lot of people did. And so that sort of just sent me down this rabbit hole of, wanting to learn as much as I could about, what was going on. And the rest is history.
On the web, I feel like history always sort of extends itself into odd, interesting ways. I mean, you talk about making a sort of horse fan site. I mean, I feel like fan sites, I don't get to see as many fan sites anymore. Like that's how too, everyone had a fan site.
Yeah.
I mean, mine was, I'm still a huge X-Files fan. So like, I remember making one like in the mid 90s being like, yeah. Because you know what, there needs to be more Mulder and Scully fan art online.
Yeah, I mean, we started with like probably in the same where there was GeoCities and Angel Fire sites and things like that you could make. And this was, for me, it was like I wanted to play like this game about like horse showing and trading because I'm actually like a farm kid and that was what interested me as a person. And then these tools and these technologies were a way to express that interest in a different medium, which was the web. And, from there, I have just found a lot of interesting, things to learn and explore through this tool. And I didn't ever think that I would get that interested in the tool. And it turns out that I am. So that's cool. I'm also still interested in horses, but, I don't have a horse here in Boston. They're kind of hard to keep in your backyard of your condo.
Yeah, I think we have like statues of horses, which I've seen some college students, have a little too much fun with. But so Jory, that's a really great background story. And I think many people can relate to that as well. And so at joining Boku, I'm a lot more exposed to the standards world purely because of the work that we do with the web platform. And our participation in TC39 and the W3C now. So can you kind of lay out the landscape for developers on really what these different standards bodies are, and like what they do, who's who and who's what?
Yeah. So one important thing to note is that there's no one place where all of this work happens. It happens in a lot of different organizations, and the ones that we probably hear about most on Twitter are the W3C, which is a consortia of, and a consortia is just a bunch of companies, and it can also include individual members who have arranged to work together on some cause in some industry. There's the ECMA International, which is a standards development organization, and that's actually based in Switzerland. And that organization is what you consider like a pretty formal standards organization. They were founded in the early 1960s to work on telecom standards. So, protocols and equipment and that sort of thing, primarily for, the telephone and telecommunications companies. So you look at their membership list, and again, that's an organization of folks who have a shared interest in standardizing some particular piece of technology. And you see a lot of like phone manufacturers and, folks working old European hardware companies, things like that. Both the ECMA International Group and the W3C have affiliations with our national standards body, or I should say W3C's standards affiliation is with ANSI because it's an American company or American consortia. And that means that the work of the W3C, if they, standardize a specification, can eventually be pushed all the way up to ISO and become a global standard. And ECMA International can do the same thing, but their national standards body is the Swiss standards body. And then we have the WWIG, which many of you have probably understood as the organization that kind of takes care of what they call the living spec, the living standard for HTML. And those are the three sort of big primary players when it comes to our field. Sort of a mouthful there. Sorry.
It seems daunting, doesn't it? I mean, it is for a lot of folks. I mean, that right there, as that mouthful sort of comes to a conclusion of different organizations that are all sort of trying to work towards the same goal to some extent. That can be a little off-putting to developers, one might say. As a developer, I mean, obviously you didn't start directly within sort of the standards bodies. As a developer, I mean, how did you find yourself starting to have those conversations? Because I'm always curious as to, what was there? Did you run into that typical situation of, as a developer, this thing sucks and I have to go talk to someone to fix it? Because I feel like that's how a lot of people go. I need to go talk to the standards body because.
Well, I actually come at it from a different direction because I've never been the kind of person who's like interested in technology for technology's sake. I consider myself like a, sociologist a little bit. And so I've always been a lot more interested in how groups of people work together to get something done than I have in, say, the output of that product. And so, I started asking questions about, okay, well, this is HTML and this is CSS and this is JavaScript. Why? Like, why is it this? And not, something else? Why is it that we've all decided that this is what we're doing instead of, XHTML or something else? Like, so when I started asking those questions and looking for like how those decisions got made, that's when I really found a passion for looking at these different organizations and trying to study and help other people understand how they work, because it is very confusing. And I have read probably a lot more than the average person on these topics, and I've talked a lot more with other people about it than I think the average person. And it's still something that is that confuses me from time to time. I ended up actually in 2015, I wrote an article called for a list apart to kind of help explain this a little bit, called Standardization and the Open Web. And in order to just help folks sort of see it a little bit easier, because it's hard to visualize, I ended up making a little network graph visualization, just so folks can see how these things are separate, but they're so intertwined. They're like so connected. And that's maybe one of the harder things to wrap your head around.
So I find all of this very confusing, which I'm sure many people do as well. So I've got like a 2-part question to kind of maybe help with some of this. So the first one is probably quite an obvious question, and the first question is, why are web standards important? Again, that's quite obvious, but I'd really like to hear your answer on that. And then the second part would be, given how confusing it can be with all these different organizations and understanding what they all do and which part of the specs that each of these different organizations can take care of, etc., why should developers care? So yeah, if you could answer those 2 questions, that'd be amazing.
Okay, so the first question is, what's a web standard really, and why is it important? So a standard is, when we talk about, and I'm going to speak specifically about a de jure standard, which is a consensus standard, meaning it's a specification for some technology or some way of like working with a thing that a group of people have agreed we're all going to do it the same way. And that's important because it levels playing fields. And that's sort of like the thing that I feel maybe most strongly about in terms of like where we're at today as a society is like with a standard, we can create a level playing field for organizations to offer like, products and services and things on top of that don't create lock-in for consumers. You don't have to, because we have standards today, you don't have to, just use Chrome or just use Firefox to reach a certain application or tool that you're using. You can use any browser to go check your bank website or, update your Facebook profile or whatever, because all of the browsers have agreed to adopt the same standard and to work together to resolve interoperability issues. And I think that's the reason, in a nutshell, why web developers should care, because we have this consensus and we have this agreement that we're all going to implement the technology in the same way. We don't have to worry about, writing specific exceptions for different or potentially wholly different applications for different implementations, different browsers. We can just write one code base, because really what the consumer cares about is, quickly accessing whatever their application is, as opposed to, I really care about Chrome, or, your parents don't know what any of this stuff is, right? And that's, and they shouldn't necessarily.
Yeah, that's a really great answer and an amazing analogy, Jory. So in the spirit of, trying to make things interoperable, as engineers, there's a lot of frustration around like, why can't we break the web, or, the slowness around standards forming, and it takes years for something like service workers to land in a browser from like inception to implementation. And so can you kind of shed some light on that? And if you were talking to a really angry developer that just kind of is like, oh, stupid standards, they're more of a hindrance than like a,
yeah.
Than a
so, my answer to that is that we really have to look at the web itself as not just a platform for us to like build products and make some money on, but rather as like an important communication medium for public policy. And that's really, and when you think about it that way, you start to understand that the time scale of the web is important, not in terms of like, what can you get done this month or this year, but what may be important in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now, because, this is something that is and has had a just remarkable impact on our society, on culture, and has really transformed the way we work, both in terms of like what you and I do every day, and also in terms of the way like commerce and business and these things have evolved over the last 20 years. So you have to take, as frustrating as it might be, you have to take a little bit of a longer view in terms of the web and thinking about the web as a product, because we can't just change it up from month to month, because that's like the great thing that your application needs for that particular milestone. This is a platform that's going to be around for hopefully a very, very, very long time. And it's taken some time to mature to the point that it is now. And we need to be thinking about it, in terms of not just the next few months again, but also the next decade or longer. And that's why we can't just make decisions rashly about, it's one of the reasons why we can't make rash decisions about, forcing something in that may not fit with that longer term direction. Was there a second part of that question? I'm sorry. I kind of rambled a bit and I forget.
Oh, no, it's an awesome ramble. And I think the second part was, let's see. So breaking the web and like, and why is it so slow, right?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
why is
Yeah.
it so slow?
So some of that slowness does come from the fact that we do have to look at if we were going to think about the web as, say, a product that we were managing, and not just any old product, but a product that we really want to be around in like 400 years, then we have to take that long-term view and say, okay, this is the direction we're going. Does this move? This change that we want to make, does this push us closer to that direction? Does it set us back? Does it take us potentially down a different path? Like, are we making based on the long-term goal and the strategies that we have forth, are we making the right decision today to create the reality we want to see? And that's never, when you think about doing this at your place of work, it may be a fairly arduous and annoying process that happens once a year in January or December. And that's just for your product, right? But we're talking about the web here, and there's no one person that owns the web. The web belongs to all of us. That's something that like Tim Berners-Lee has really been emphasizing this week. The web is ours. It's what we make of it. And so that means going out, having important conversations with a lot of different stakeholders when there's a specification that's being assessed. Who's it impacting? Is it actually moving us in the direction we want to go? And that's not something that can just happen quickly over Slack or, after a couple of like company-wide meetings because we don't really have that. So that's one factor. And then another factor is, quite frankly, the way a lot of development organizations operate, is a little bit slow. And that's one of the things that I'm interested in studying and putting forward some ideas on is how to speed up that process, just generally, so that like we can start to get consensus-driven decisions a little bit more quickly. Because at this rate, because of the way a lot of them work, there will be and here I can just pop down and to describe at a high level how it works for like TC39, for example. That committee will spend a good deal of time really evaluating, assessing, and making important decisions on ECMAScript. They will reach their consensus decision and author that specification, and it becomes a candidate for the General Assembly of ECMA to vote on. And that's usually, they vote on those at meetings, GA meetings, that happen twice a year. So it could be that they finish some work on a specification in, say, January, and then the next GA meeting is in June. So there's 6 months before that specification actually officially becomes, the full standard. And then it can take a while to move on up from there if it's going to go up to the Joint Technical Committee, if it's going to go on up to ISO. So sometimes our process slows us down. And that's the also reality of working with a lot of different people and a lot of different orgs.
Yeah, when you start to look at the overall structure of how standards sort of grow from initial sort of concept, a lot of developers seem to, they say, well, it's always the biggest players, right? Like I can't get a membership seat on the W3C because I'm not one of the big players. I'm not a browser vendor, for instance, and I'm not going to put forth my idea because I'm going to get outvoted or it's not good enough for that sort of thing. As a developer who's sort of outside that sphere where you have a lot of these processes that seem very daunting to them, how might you get started within that sort of thing? Like if I, as a, theoretical developer who's got an idea for, say, TC39, how might I go about doing that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so the first thing I want to say is that, if you're just an individual, if you developer out there in the world, like do not assume that you can't make a difference and that you can't participate, because you absolutely can. It may not be immediately clear how to do that, and I am very happy to help you figure out how to do that. But just because you're not a browser vendor or you're at a smaller company, doesn't mean you can't make a difference. Boku has like 15 people, and we're in it. And so I promise you that that your size doesn't matter. There's some like wonderful stories of like interested groups of developers making a difference. And here I'll shout out to Matt Marquis and his work with the Responsive Images community group, which fought like an amazing battle to get their specification into the standard. So for the image element. So, and there's a whole history about that, which I can share a link to or whatever. So you can absolutely make a difference. And it really starts with figuring out, what is it that you're proposing? What technology do you want to change, or, what thing do you want to do, and finding the right working group or community group or technical committee to fit. And the beautiful thing, I think, in part is beautiful, in part it's kind of complicated, is that there could be multiple places to do that work. So, fun fact, there's some standards that are actually standardized or some specifications that are actually standardized in multiple organizations, like JSON, which is standardized both with ECMA and then also with the IETF. So there could be a couple places that you do your work. And the W3C actually makes it really pretty easy for you to start a community group. And that's just the lowest sort of like level in terms of this is a group of people who care about this thing and they're going to work on it and have conversations and figure out what problems it really solves and what the solution might be, and try and get stakeholders to come in and weigh in and determine whether it needs to like grow into a formal specification. So that's one way. If you've got an idea for a new feature or something for TC39, they're actually doing a whole thing now where we're working on making that a lot more clear, how just developers who are not members of the ECMA group can submit a proposal via GitHub and find a champion on TC39 to bring that to committee and have a good, healthy debate and conversation about it. Sorry. So, it does bring in that kind of community element. You can follow along on GitHub issues with the work there. So it's not, it's not closed off to you. It can feel sometimes like everything is pay to play. And if you're not Google or you're not Facebook or one of these big platforms that you can't have a say. But I think that's more perception than reality.
So, Jory, we've kind of been touching on this theme of like the internet is this public utility, right? And it's bigger than any one app, one feature, one API, and it has to work for everybody. And so that being said, how much of the standardization process is done in the open? Is it all open? And if not, like what parts are not open? And I guess I'd like to touch on open source next, but I'll let you answer that.
Yeah. So that's a fantastic question, Amel, because I think, in a way, what's happened a little bit is that there's been some conflation of two really important things that happen in our industry. And one is like the development of open source tools and, libraries and things like that. And the other is the standards development process. And they have different, sometimes very different objectives and outcomes. So a standard is not necessarily an open standard. there's sort of two different ideas. We can have standards that are proprietary, meaning that some organization has put forth, technology or, ideas or whatever, that a group of folks has agreed, okay, that's going to be, a standard, and maybe they pay a license fee or something of that nature to the organization that's provided, that IP in the first place. And those are definitely not the kind of standards that we want to see on the web. So the W3C and TC39 in particular have very transparent, shall we say, standardization processes where, they try and do their very best to show everybody not only what's being evaluated, what specification is being evaluated, but also how the decision-making process is going to go to the best that they, to the extent of their ability to do so that the public can see over the long term, okay, here's what decision is being made. Here's how that decision is being made. And then for open standards like HTML and CSS and JavaScript, there's no license fee or any kind of payment that one has to make in order to implement those standards, which is really important, a really important idea. Because it could be that if JavaScript itself were not an open standard, that anybody who wanted to implement it had to pay a fee to ECMA. But it's an open standard, so no fee. Those are kind of different ideas in a way than say, using an open source project with an MIT license or something like that.
So who owns the IP for things that are developed through a standardization process? So if I'm making a proposal, am I signing away my IP? How does that work?
Yeah, so each org is a little bit different, but the idea is that the standards development organization who has been bringing that specification forward and curating that standard holds the patents and holds the IP for that. And it may be that if you are a member, and again, it will depend on, I'm going to generalize just to all kinds, because there's standards for all kinds of things in the world. There are standards for headphone jacks and, chargers and screws and 2x4s and, anything, right? So it may be that as a member of a standards development organization, you can you pay no fee for using that organization's specifications or standards, but in the case of our open web standards, there's no fee.
When we talk about standards, the thing that sometimes there are mistakes and there are definitely disagreements within sort of the process of that thing. Especially when I think of the IP sort of argument about, because this, I hear that come up a lot. A lot of people point to the, what happened at the W3C with EME, encrypted media extensions, for those who have never used encrypted media extension, which was a big deal at the time. And this was probably, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago now, over the nature of what that standard meant and who sort of pushed it forward. And there was definitely huge disagreements within a lot of folks within that process, particularly the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Free Software Foundation, and other community groups that come out against it as well and said this is not a good standard for the web, kind of goes against what it goes against what the web is in terms of its openness and the notion of DRM and those sorts of things, or digital rights management. I mean, there are definitely disagreements within those orgs. How does one, I'm sure you've seen your TC39. I hear there was never a disagreement about anything at TC39 in terms of
all the time. Very, very.
Do you find the debate? Do you find the debates interesting in terms of the scope of that? Because there is, one reason that a lot of a lot of the lag that happens where, wow, why don't I get this feature faster, is that a lot of engineering goes into these things. Like, these aren't just willy-nilly sort of, oh, we're just going to add a new method and a new endpoint and magically it all works. There's quite a bit of debate, and that debate can be fairly decent and interesting in and of itself. I mean, how does one manage those sorts of things on a daily basis, though? Because I sit on the mailing lists. I see all sorts of things that I'm not sure anyone would say to people in person, but there's lots of those sorts of things. Do you find it difficult to sort of manage within that scope as you see these disagreements and these sort of debates happen?
That is a good question. So, I think one benefit, I suppose, of open standards processes is that, you can follow along and you can see what goes on behind the curtain. But that also opens you up to seeing a bit more how the sausage is made when maybe you just want to eat the sausage. You know what I mean? So you can look at other, technologies that are standardized, and you don't see quite as much disagreement or read about quite as much disagreement, in part because it's not nearly as open a process. So part of it is that when we see all of this is because these organizations and these groups have made such a commitment to open and transparent processes. So, if you find yourself feeling like, wow, this is like a lot to try and keep track of, and like, why is there so much drama and disagreement and all that sort of thing? It's because it's open for you to look at, right? And you don't necessarily, like, if that's not your cup of tea and you don't want to keep track of it, you really don't have to. You can, use the latest version of ES that has, and another point about why it takes so long sometimes is we don't just want to propose a way of doing things. We also want to make sure that there are plenty examples of it being implemented, and that those implementations have been tested and so on and so forth before we go out releasing it into the wild. That's another thing that we need to do to make sure that we don't break the web. And that takes time. So you can say, you know what, I'm as cool as all this stuff is, and I could use Babel or some other things to sort of compile it down to the latest version of the spec. You don't have to, and you can unplug if it's a bit too much. But it can get a bit challenging, I should say, to keep track of all of the threads. Yeah,
it's a good word.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Challenging and chocolate craving inducing. Oh my gosh. Anyways.
On that note, can you think of any really good reasons why developers should get more involved and more aware of all of these different conversations that are going on, these arguments, and really trying to understand more about how these standards come about? Can you think of any good reasons as to not ignoring it?
Yeah,
you know
so that's a good... yes, I do. I can. But maybe it's more because this is me personally, versus because I don't want to... I don't want to say, hey, I do this, so I think everybody else should, but that's a little bit what I'm saying in a certain way. I'm the kind of person, so I think of myself as a social constructionist, being like that, the web, as it is today, is a thing that we've created together, and it's always valuable to me to understand how a thing was made, and how it is managed and maintained, and how it evolves, because for me it helps me be a lot more empathetic toward the things that are going on, because some things may or may not be in my control. And so by understanding the process and understanding just how much work goes into this, not just from folks who are at the W3C or at Whatwig or at ECMA, but by, folks who are just regular old developers who had this idea and want to see this difference made. And they're volunteers in a lot of ways. A lot of the folks who chair community groups and working groups for the W3C, that's not something they're paid to do. It's something that they're doing because they're very passionate about it. And when you start to explore the process and explore like the system that we created for these people to work together, you get a lot more empathy for the people who are doing the work. So when there's a disagreement about, something like smoosh or, flatten, you see the people behind that, and you see the process behind that, and you stop to think about that. And I just find that it puts things into perspective more. And of course, if you're the kind of person who likes that sort of history and likes that sort of digging, then I think you'll find it to be a fascinating field. But if not, you also can ignore it.
It also gives you a much greater appreciation for the end result as well, right? So, even some of the simplest, specs or features or whatever, if you looking back at, the discussions and stuff, and you think, wow, how much effort has all these different people have put in to figure out the best way of doing this thing. So, it's humbling in a sense that we take a lot of things for granted, and there's so much effort gone into figuring out these things. It's nice to kind of see that and take a more of an appreciation for those things.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at some specifications, I mean, we're talking thousands, and on aggregate with all of the specifications, like millions probably of hours of human effort that has gone into, trying to improve something for the benefit of literally everybody on the planet. And that's not something that we should just, toss aside and leave unappreciated. I mean, especially with some specifications like accessibility standards. I mean, those folks are doing some very critically important work for a population of people who really, could use that help, and they're not getting paid for it. And yeah, there's disagreements, but at the end of the day, since they can, I think you can look at genuine benefit that it's creating for people, that really does humble you and put things into perspective.
That's super cool, Jory. So for me, contributing to standards feels a little bit like a privilege, and it absolutely is. And as many people who kind of, want to poo-poo on standards committees or standards bodies, it takes a lot of work. And if you actually look at the number of people that are really digging in and submitting to specs and, giving feedback, implementing the work, it's a very small group of people. So in that sense, it feels very privileged. I mean, is there anything that we could do to make the process feel more inclusive and less I don't know. I mean, there's nowhere that you go and learn about, how to read a spec or how to contribute to a web standard, right? And I mean, that kind of it doesn't feel like a very democratic process in that regard. It could be as open as it is. I can go and read the spec and I can see how things are made, but no one's really teaching people how to do this and how to contribute to the conversation. So, I mean, I don't know. I guess, do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree with you, Amel. I think just because something is, just because we have open standards doesn't mean that it is, and it's certainly that way in spirit, doesn't mean that it is 100. It's always open and accessible in practice. And part of, in my opinion, part of the reason why it's not is because there is such a big knowledge gap, for people even just to try and get started. I spent, 3 minutes at the top of the hour here trying to explain how all of these freaking things work together, and I'm sure somebody's eyes glazed over somewhere, because it's a lot. It's very dense, and that's not very easy to get into. So one of the things we can do is certainly just make the process and the not just the process, but also the reasoning behind the process more obvious. And do more. I think our standards organizations and our technology foundations can do more to help educate, provide tutorials, blog posts, screencasts, talks, that kind of thing, to educate people like what this system is, why it is the way it is, how they can get involved, and so on and so forth. And so to some extent, like there's a little bit of like knowledge is power / agency. And so if we can spread the knowledge around, then maybe we can spread the agency and the accessibility around. But that's only part of the equation. The other part of the equation is that there's a bit of a PR problem that the whole process has, in my opinion, which is that like it's because it is open and we get to see a lot of like the dirty sausage making and the disagreements and that kind of thing. That's kind of off-putting to a lot of people, I think, who don't necessarily want to go like argue with usually old white guys about a specific point of view. I mean, and that's just, I think that's the perception of it, so as far as I can tell. And so, I think we need to start kind of changing the look and the feel of it from the outside, so that folks can start to see that it's not necessarily this like negative experience, and that there are different perspectives and voices beyond like old language wonks to engage and work with, in the process. And that's something that I think TC39 in particular has done a good job like recognizing as a problem and trying to take steps to change that.
I'm really glad that we touched upon this point, because I didn't actually realize it until now, but it's important to say it, that there's a very serious diversity problem in the standards world. And it's not ethnic diversity, which is, what people immediately think of. It's, it's gender diversity, it's lifestyle diversity, it's, just in what they're doing on a day-to-day, like, are they all academics? Are they practitioners? Are they implementers? Like, it doesn't feel like we have a healthy enough mix. And I think TC39 has been really kind of, to me, they're the model of people, a committee that's really doing it well and taking better strides to be more diverse and inclusive, and have better processes as a result of that. And I think you were involved with the code of conduct for TC39. Do you want to tell us about that?
Oh yeah. So I think. And it's hard to say because I haven't been involved with the committee for terribly long, but it's our colleague Leo Balter and Rick Waldron. They've both been participants for quite some time, and it strikes me that after some like real negative experiences, and some negative fallout of conversations and that kind of thing on the committee, they were like, let's see what we can do to change this, because this is not helping anybody. Like nobody's having fun. And to top it off, it's we don't really exactly look like a group of people who's representative of the web development community and implementation companies writ large. So what can we do? And I think they really took a page from the work that Node.js has been doing, which many thanks to Miles and Tracy and Dan and a number of folks over there for their blogging and writing and all the work that they've done to make their process one that lots of folks can learn from, because we've really taken a page from that to see, what are some things that we can do and we can change to help make this group feel a lot more welcoming and a lot more like a team of folks who reflect the people that we're trying to represent. Because it is a privilege to be there, and it's a privilege to get to have these conversations. And if we're going to advocate not just for our own interests, but also the interests of our users, we should probably look like that group of people to the extent that we possibly can. That's really been the they passed, the TC39 passed their code of conduct in the fall, and so we spun up a group and have been meeting bi-weekly for the last couple of months to start implementing a moderation policy and really defining and narrowing down what we mean, not just by a code of conduct, but a set of professional values that we think that the committee is striving to represent. So
yeah, you definitely see what happens when the definition of that sort of professional environment, that code of conduct, doesn't occur, right? I mean, in other communities that are sort of building open source applications, I mean, it's sort of a running gag, but it's somewhat unfortunate too that, you look at some of the conversations on things like the Linux kernel mailing list, which are quite frankly quite terrible by any definition, really. And you see those sorts of things that prevent people who may want to contribute within that group. And when you start to see these codes of conduct that y'all have been working on to sort of bring forth, you start to see not just the openness of the standards situation, but the openness of the ability to contribute, because you look at the way that the conversation has changed too. It's actually quite easy to comment and return feedback now. A lot of specs, particularly for WetWig, are on things like GitHub. So you can go and make a pull request against that spec, and you can have a conversation on there with the folks who are writing that spec, and you can contribute rather easily in an environment that you might feel much more comfortable in, that can be moderated down by that code of conduct. So there's definitely been a shift in the ability to not just openness, but the ability to have contribution openness, where before maybe you weren't on the right mailing list. Well, now it's much easier to find these things. And I think that's a really positive step forward, as opposed to some of the mix up between what people presume happens in a lot of the open source communities to what actually is happening, that perception of things. And that just goes to the fact that people are looking at those situations and changing for the better.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the GitHub open source generation, which is sort of like what we're in, has done a lot for kind of opening up the standards process, where where we can put specs on some kind of like public in a public place that you can fork, and then there can be a dialogue on that, and you can close the issue, or you say, oh yeah, no, that's a great idea, well, it's going to move forward. So it's a lot more easy to engage, but with the codes of conduct and that kind of thing, one benefit that I think it provides is it's sort of a signal post of these are the values of this organization, of this group of people, and this is what we're going to strive to represent and be. And in some cases, if we don't hit that, if we don't reach that goal, these are the things that we're going to do as sort of a reactive correction, where we may censor ourselves, we may delete a post, we may ask you not to come back because you're trolling or using bad language. And so it's sort of we don't really have a professional, I mean, the ACM is sort of like this, but we don't really have a professional organization that we all belong to, that had like lawyers do or doctors do or whatever. And so, these are sort of a way, it's sort of a funny tie-in, but this is sort of a way that that we can start to say, all right, as a group of professional, web practitioners, here's how we think we ought to treat each other, and how we ought to work together, and how we ought to work together to solve problems, even though we're not in the same organization. We don't all work for the same company, which very much would have some rules about what we can say to each other. And I think that's a nice service we can do for one another, treat each other like humans.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I want to also add that like the ivory tower kind of vibe with around standards is only amplified with that type of rhetoric. When you see people arguing over like minute details in a way that's disrespectful, and in a way that not in a way that's constructive, right? And so it just really adds to the I don't want to be a part of that feeling. So I can't stress it enough. So thank you so much for doing that. So we're almost out of time, but I think we have time for one last question, which is, I know, an important one for you, Jory. Justin, I think.
Oh,
you want to talk about OS development process and standard development processes and how they are massively different?
I can probably do that in 30 seconds. Sure.
And they should not be the same.
Yeah, and how
it's a small topic.
It's a small topic. Yeah. No, you're not going to, but well, essentially, yeah. I guess I'll ask the question formally, which is, open source development processes and standards development processes often get conflated, and so, I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this kind of harkens to what we were saying earlier, where like open source has definitely had this very positive impact, in my opinion, on our web standards development processes, because like we're posting, progress and updates and that kind of thing in more publicly accessible places. It's a lot easier for folks to kind of fork and follow along with conversations than it was, before. And generally there's some great, things that have been, I think, bleeding over into the standards development world. But when you think about like, okay, what's the purpose of a standard? It's really to specify how two different things are gonna, work, are going to communicate. You can think about it as like a bridge between, two different, you've got a, cliff on one side and a cliff on another. And the standard itself is the bridge that combines like two different technologies. And so, that is a little bit different than, say, an open source project, which may just be like, how something works a little bit differently or a little bit better in one piece of technology. Like there's I don't know how many at this point, JavaScript libraries and tools and things like that. But not everything that we create, if we take, the JavaScript ecosystem, for example, not everything that we create as an open source project in the JS ecosystem, it needs to become a standard. Not everything needs to be specified. And that's something that, I think that's a point that sometimes gets, lost. I mean, we can certainly, for your open source project, you can author some documentation and everything and say, okay, this is a specification for how this thing really works. But that doesn't need to actually grow up and become like, an ISO standard one day. But I think that there's some conflation that sometimes, because something has been specified, it's a standard, or because something has been used a lot, it's a standard. We might have a tool or a technology that is so pervasive that it feels like a de facto standard, but that doesn't necessarily, just because it's popular doesn't mean that it's a standard. I notice, I've noticed for a while that in a number of our open source communities and libraries and repos on GitHub and that sort of thing, we're borrowing a lot of language from the standards development process that maybe isn't, exactly needed. It isn't exactly, due to laziness of language or whatever, isn't exactly accurate. And I think that leads to some conflation between these processes that only kind of adds to the confusion. Trying to think of a good example of that. I maybe one example might be in Node, where this is like just a massively successful, project and tool, and it's certainly something that is de facto in terms of its use in a number of organizations and everything, but there's not actually an official specification for that, and it may be something that we want to standardize outside of separately of the ECMAScript specification, or it may not be. But I wonder how many people think Node is actually a standard. That's me musing. Sorry, out loud. Apologies.
Yeah, I think I did until I had that conversation with you a while ago. Not that it was a standard, but I thought that it was a lot more formal than it actually is.
Well, it is in a way, but then again, we get to that sort of like laziness of language. It's hard to be precise about ideas, especially when those ideas are socially constructed ideas, and it's not necessarily the case that open source means the same thing to everybody. I'm sure we would write down, the four of us would write down 4 very different definitions for open source. So there's that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, and Node has like their own. There's a technical committee. It's just not as it's not at the ECMA international level of standardization.
It's a technical committee and a technical steering committee, and they do a lot of the same kind of work that TC39 does, and a lot of the same kind of work that the working groups of W3C do. Like their processes are very similar. It's just that at the end of the day, it's not all kind of summarized and converted into a specification that a formal agency goes and votes on and says, okay, yes, this is a du jour standard for Node. It's instead, work that's done and protected by the Node Foundation, which is a member trade organization. So.
Yeah, there's definitely not necessarily a need for it to be a standards body either. I think that's another thing that, to your point, that you don't have to be. My wonderful cat picture extension to the HTML standard doesn't need to be a formalized specification. It can just be my little world of a thing, and that's okay because we can still all use it and still get work done.
Yeah. And we should all use your cat picture extension for sure.
You definitely should. I feel like, I'll propose it at a meeting upcoming, and because realistically, let's all be honest, it would get massive use.
Yeah, definitely.
Because who doesn't like cat pictures on the net? But I digress, and we're running up against time. Jory, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast.
Is there anything that we did not particularly ask that we probably should have asked because we've just been conversating and just forgot?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. It's hard to say. I think, I'm very, very hippy dippy, and I think anything that needed to be asked has been asked.
Well, I have one last ask, which is a really simple one. I hope if you could come up with a Twitter something that would fit in one Twitter post for what your wish, if you had one standards wish, what would it be?
Oh, in 40 characters or less. 140 characters.
Well, we'll do it in a 240. We'll do it the new Twitter standard.
I forgot that they did that. Oh.
I wish everyone forgot they did that.
Yeah. Okay. So one wish, if I could summarize it, that's a good question. What would I wish? That everybody maybe take a minute and thank the folks that have been working on these in these working groups and community groups and technical committees and all that have been working to standardize the tools that you're using, because it's a difficult task and they've worked very hard, and certainly a lot of them are not more popular for it, and so I, for one, really appreciate the sacrifice of their time and, patience sometimes. And I think they might like to hear that too. So thank you, everyone, on behalf of me, Jory.
Fine words. I agree. It's tough. It's a thankless job out there doing some of this. And I know that here on the show, we've thanked the web standards folks a lot because we know it's tough. And
we named our podcast after the web.
We had reasons. Reasons were deep. Again, thank you so much, Jory. If people want to contact you, what's the best way they can find you online and things?
I am at jory.com on Twitter and GitHub, and you can totally holler at me either of those spots or yeah.
Fantastic.
There, that's good.
Well, thank you again so much for being on the show. Leon, Amal, closing thoughts before we round out episode number 158.
Just that I've really enjoyed this conversation, so thank you, Jory, for coming on and chatting to us.
Yeah, and all of the links will be in the show notes for a bunch of things that Jory talked about, plus links to all the different standards bodies and community working groups.
Fantastic. Well, this has been episode number 158 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today we've been talking about the world of web standards with Jory Burson. Tune in next week when we discuss more things web, about how hopefully we can move the web forward and make the world a little bit a better place. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your week.